A single forgotten book held the power to shatter centuries of artistic tradition. This is the story of a lost medieval manuscript that sparked a creative revolution, and by the end, you will understand how a single rediscovered object can permanently alter our entire visual world. How did a text deemed crude and strange by its first viewers become a secret handbook for modern masters? What hidden code within its pages gave artists permission to break every rule? Why does the most powerful art often emerge from the most unexpected places? What forgotten masterpiece do you believe is still waiting to be found? Deep within the quiet solitude of a monastery, anonymous hands brought this book to life. It was not born as a revolutionary text, but as an act of profound devotion. In a secluded scriptorium, lit only by candlelight, scribes spent countless hours meticulously copying biblical commentary and philosophical thoughts onto pages of prepared animal skin. Their inks were not simple dyes, but complex alchemical mixtures, forged from crushed minerals like lapis lazuli for celestial blue and rust-colored earth for a deep, bloody red. Each page was a testament to their faith and their incredible resourcefulness, a physical object saturated with intellectual and spiritual fervor. For generations, its audience was tiny, a closed circle of monks and scholars who saw in its pages a guide to the divine, not a blueprint for a new kind of beauty. Its radical potential lay dormant, a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout. The manuscript's own story mirrors the art it would later inspire, beginning in quiet obscurity before its sudden, dramatic return to the center of the world. How does an object so deeply embedded in one specific tradition break free to speak to an entirely different age? The answer lies in its long sleep and the unexpected moment of its awakening. Political chaos and the slow decay of a remote monastery sealed the book's fate. As wars redrew maps and religious priorities shifted, the great libraries of Europe began to change. Newly printed books, faster to produce and easier to distribute, started to arrive on shelves. In this new world, a single, hand-copied manuscript on animal skin could easily be seen as obsolete. It was not deliberately destroyed but quietly set aside. The vibrant blues and reds of its pages, once so precious, were packed into a wooden chest or slipped behind a row of more modern volumes. There, in the cool, dry darkness, it rested. For generations, it was utterly forgotten. Its name appeared only on a few old inventory lists, cryptic entries written in fading ink that later librarians could no longer fully decipher. The manuscript became a ghost, a whisper of pigment and parchment. Its revolutionary ideas on art and form entered a deep sleep, completely insulated from the world. This is how knowledge vanishes, not in a dramatic blaze, but through simple, quiet neglect. The most dangerous threat to a great idea is often not opposition, but indifference. What other treasures do you think are still hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to simply look? The manuscript's long silence ended not with a trumpet blast, but with the soft rustle of old paper. In the early 1800s, a book collector or a librarian, perhaps a young man with a patient eye, was likely sifting through a recent donation from a monastery that had closed its doors for good. The task was routine, sorting through stacks of worn volumes that all seemed to blur together. Then, one book refused to be ignored. While its neighbors had faded into a uniform brown, this one's colors seemed to leap from the page. A brilliant blue, made from lapis lazuli that had cost a fortune centuries earlier, shone as if freshly painted. In the margins, strange, energetic little drawings twisted and turned, figures that were more expressive than perfectly rendered. The initial reaction was not one of triumphant discovery, but of pure confusion. This was not like the other books. It was rougher, more immediate, and utterly unfamiliar. That moment of accidental attention, a simple pause in a day of tedious work, was all it took. The book was pulled from the pile destined for obscurity and placed into curious hands. Its long journey back into the world had begun with a single, quiet question. What makes us stop and look twice at something everyone else has passed over? That flicker of curiosity, that willingness to be puzzled, is often the very spark that ignites a revolution. The first scholars to hold the manuscript saw its strangeness as a flaw. To eyes trained on the serene, idealized figures of high medieval art, these pages seemed almost chaotic. The human forms were not perfectly proportioned but elongated and twisted with raw emotion. Colors clashed in unexpected ways, with deep crimson skies and emerald green faces that defied all natural logic. The immediate, dismissive verdict was that this was provincial work, the clumsy efforts of a monk isolated from the great artistic centers, someone who simply did not know the rules. They tried to categorize it as a failed attempt to copy a more sophisticated style, forcing its unique visual language into boxes it was never meant to fit. This initial rejection is a classic pattern. A radical new idea rarely announces itself as a masterpiece. It first appears as a mistake, an outlier that challenges everything we think we know. The very qualities that made the manuscript revolutionary, its expressive distortion and symbolic color, were the same ones that made it easy to dismiss. It took a different kind of observer, someone willing to set aside their own artistic rulebook to ask a more profound question. What if these were not failures of technique but deliberate choices? What if the artist was not ignoring the rules but was instead following a different, more personal set of principles altogether? The breakthrough came when a handful of art historians stopped judging the book by what it was not and started to listen to what it was trying to say. They noticed how the distorted figures conveyed a powerful sense of spiritual anguish or ecstasy, how the unnatural colors were not meant to depict the physical world, but to illuminate an inner, emotional landscape. The manuscript's true genius had been hiding in the very features everyone else had labeled as crude. How often do we mistake a new language for mere noise, simply because we have not yet learned how to listen? The manuscript's pages refused to surrender their secrets easily. To the untrained eye, they were a beautiful chaos of color and line, but to the few experts who committed years to their study, they revealed a hidden grammar. This was not a simple picture book. It was a complex visual language where every element, from the shade of a robe to the curl of a vine, was a deliberate word in a silent poem. The artist used color not to depict reality, but to paint emotion itself. A sky might be a searing crimson not to show a sunset, but to convey a moment of divine wrath or passionate love. A face rendered in deep emerald green was not a mistake. It was a symbol of renewal or perhaps envy. Even the recurring motifs were dense with meaning. A winding river snaking through multiple pages was far more than a decorative border. It was a profound metaphor for the relentless flow of time or the winding, uncertain path of a spiritual journey. A specific, oddly shaped flower that appeared again and again might represent a particular virtue or a philosophical concept lost to time. Piecing together this symbolic lexicon was like learning a forgotten dialect. The scholars were not just looking at art, they were decoding a message. They realized that the so-called crudeness of the figures was actually a form of visual shorthand, a way to strip away physical perfection and get directly to the raw, emotional core of a scene. This code-breaking process was absolutely essential. It transformed the manuscript from a curious artifact into a coherent, if deeply personal, statement. Unlocking this visual grammar was the key to understanding its true power, a power that would soon give other artists permission to speak in a new and daring emotional tongue. What does it mean to read a painting, not just see one? When you place this manuscript next to the masterpieces of its own time, its radical nature becomes undeniable. The established art of the era presented a world of perfect, orderly stillness. Saints and kings were depicted with serene, unchanging faces, their bodies arranged in formal poses against flat fields of gold leaf. It was a visual language of divine hierarchy, meant to inspire awe and reverence through its perfect, untouchable beauty. But this book was different. Its pages seem to vibrate with a restless energy. The human figures within it are not static icons, they are bodies in motion, bending, straining, and twisting with a raw, tangible emotion. A saint in prayer is not merely kneeling, his entire form is coiled in a fervent, almost desperate plea. The natural world is not a symbolic backdrop of tidy trees, but a wild, tangled garden where every leaf and vine seems to be actively growing. This was not a rejection of spirituality, but a profound reinterpretation of it. The artist sought the divine not in perfect stillness, but in the messy, beautiful chaos of life itself. They chose to capture a fleeting moment of human feeling over an eternal, idealized pose. This shift from the iconic to the human, from the static to the dynamic, was its most explosive quality. How do you paint a soul, not just a saint? This manuscript offered one daring answer. Its experimental techniques served this new vision. The artist layered pigments in unconventional ways, building up colors to create a startling sense of depth and texture that makes a simple robe feel heavy with wool or a sky feel thick with impending storm. And the use of gold leaf was utterly transformed. In traditional works, gold was a flat, brilliant background, separating the holy from the earthly. Here, gold was applied in delicate, shimmering filaments that seemed to glow from within the scene itself, as if divine light was bursting from the core of the action, illuminating a face from the inside or setting a humble object ablaze. These were not the naive errors of an isolated monk. They were the deliberate, calculated choices of a visionary. Every anomaly, every break from tradition, was a conscious step toward a more immersive and emotionally resonant art. The very features that made it an outlier in its own century are precisely what made it a priceless guidebook for artists centuries later, who are also yearning to break free and paint the world not as it should be, but as it truly felt. The manuscript's path from scholarly curiosity to public fascination was a slow burn. Its first formal introduction to the world was a quiet one, a brief description buried in the pages of an obscure academic journal. The article generated little more than a ripple, read by a handful of specialists who likely filed it away as an oddity. For years, it remained in that limbo, known but not truly seen. Its fate changed during a routine visit. A prominent museum curator, browsing a private collection, paused at the open pages. Where others had seen crudeness, this curator saw a potent, untamed energy. That single, captivated gaze was the turning point. The curator championed the book, securing its place in a modest exhibition titled Forgotten Masterpieces. There, surrounded by more polished and predictable works, the manuscript did not just hang on the wall, it seemed to vibrate against it. Its emotional figures and searing colors created a jarring, unforgettable contrast. Artists and critics walking through the show found their eyes drawn back again and again to this one disruptive presence. They were not just looking at an old book, they were witnessing a different way of feeling made visible. Soon, black and white photographic reproductions of its most powerful pages began to pass from hand to hand in studios and cafes. These grainy copies became talismans for a new generation of creators who were hungry for a visual language unshackled from tradition. That small exhibition case was the portal through which this forgotten text finally stepped into the modern world, ready to whisper its secrets to those willing to listen. The manuscript's journey into the modern art world began not in grand museums, but in the quiet corners of struggling studios. A handful of painters, already feeling the stiff constraints of academic tradition, discovered the manuscript's reproductions and saw themselves reflected in its pages. Here was an art that did not worship perfect anatomy or mathematical perspective, but instead chased the raw tremor of a feeling. These artists were not celebrated masters. They were the outsiders, the illustrators and visionaries whose own work was often dismissed as too emotional or too strange. In the manuscript's emerald green faces and crimson skies, they found a long-lost relative, a voice from the past that gave them the courage to trust their own eyes. One such painter, working in a cramped Parisian garret, began to experiment with the manuscript's symbolic color language. He painted a portrait of his grieving friend, not with realistic flesh tones, but with a palette of deep blues and grays, making the man's sorrow a tangible, visible force. Another artist, captivated by the dynamic, twisting figures, let her lines break free from their outlines, allowing her drawings to quiver with a contained energy that critics called messy, but which felt more true to life than any polished study. Their canvases became the first real-world test of the manuscript's power. When these works were exhibited, the reaction was predictably harsh. Reviewers scoffed at the unnatural colors and the distorted forms, echoing the very same criticisms the manuscript itself had received a century earlier. But this time, something was different. A small, passionate segment of the public looked at these bewildering new paintings and felt a shock of recognition. They saw not failure, but a profound honesty. These early adopters, by borrowing the manuscript's visual vocabulary, had done something revolutionary. They had created a bridge. They proved that this forgotten medieval text was not a relic, but a toolkit. It was a living, breathing source of creative fuel that could ignite new art in the present. Their courage in the face of ridicule was the essential spark. They were the first to translate a forgotten dialect of emotion into a modern tongue, proving that the most potent artistic revolutions often begin with a few brave voices speaking a language no one else yet understands. What does it take to see the future in a relic of the past? This was not a style, it was a statement. The manuscript's true power lay not in its brushstrokes but in its philosophy, a radical belief that art's highest purpose was to capture an inner truth, not an external reality. While the established art of its time aimed for a kind of divine and serene perfection, this book embraced the messy, complicated landscape of human feeling. Its goal was not to show you a beautiful saint, but to make you feel the weight of that saint's devotion or the sharp sting of their doubt. It asked a fundamental question: should a painting be a window to a perfect world, or a mirror reflecting the full spectrum of the soul? Every deliberate choice on its pages served this emotional core. An elongated, stretched-out figure was not a failure of anatomy. It was a visual cry of yearning, a body straining toward heaven. A distorted, compressed space was not a clumsy perspective. It was a way to make the viewer feel the psychological pressure of a moment, the walls of a room closing in during a moment of despair. The artist even collapsed time itself, showing multiple events from a story within a single frame, not out of confusion, but to convey the overwhelming, simultaneous rush of memory and prophecy. These were not mistakes. They were the grammar of a new visual language, one that valued expression over precision. This philosophy was the ideological bedrock of the coming revolution because it gave artists something they desperately needed: permission. It granted them the moral and aesthetic authority to break the old rules of composition and form. It argued convincingly that a distorted line could hold more beauty than a perfect circle if it trembled with genuine feeling. It proved that beauty was not a fixed standard of harmony, but a quality that could be found in the raw, unfiltered expression of what it means to be alive. How do you paint an emotion? This forgotten manuscript offered a breathtaking answer, and in doing so, it handed a key to the future. This symbolic language was the key that unlocked the door. The manuscript taught a profound lesson: that the most important truths are often conveyed not through realistic depiction, but through the deliberate use of symbols. A simple object was never just an object. A broken chain rendered in tarnished silver leaf was not merely a piece of jewelry, it was a declaration of spiritual liberation. A single tree, split down the middle with barren branches on one side and lush, almost aggressive foliage on the other, became a complete portrait of the human soul, torn between despair and hope. This was the essence of its power. By prioritizing symbolic meaning over literal representation, the manuscript gave artists a new kind of freedom. They were no longer servants to photographic accuracy, chained to the task of replicating the visible world. Instead, they became poets, weaving personal and universal symbols into their work to build layers of meaning. This approach fundamentally changed the purpose of art. It was no longer just a window looking out onto a scene. It became a mirror held up to the inner landscapes of the soul and the mind. A painting could now be a conversation, a puzzle, a confession. The viewer was no longer a passive observer, but an active participant invited to decode the symbols and find their own personal resonance within the image. This invitation to interpretation is what makes such art feel so intensely personal and timeless. The manuscript argued that the most powerful realities are the ones we feel in our bones, the anxieties and the joys that have no literal shape, not just the ones we can see with our eyes. How do you paint freedom? You do not paint a document, you paint a broken chain. How do you paint a fractured heart? You paint a tree, half in shadow, half in light. The manuscript's pages sang in a color language no one had spoken for centuries. Forget about realistic skies and flesh tones. This artist wielded pigment like a weapon of pure emotion. A deep, celestial blue was not just a color, it was the physical weight of melancholy or the cool, vast silence of a divine mystery. A slash of vibrant, unexpected red was not a robe, it was the sudden heat of spiritual awakening or the raw nerve of human passion. The artist fearlessly placed these intense hues side by side, creating a visual vibration that resonated directly in the soul of the viewer. A field of deep crimson might sit beneath a sky of sickly green, not to depict a real landscape, but to evoke a feeling of profound unease, a world out of spiritual balance. This was color freed from its descriptive chains. It no longer served the story, it became the story. The emotional impact was immediate and visceral, bypassing the logical mind to speak directly to the heart. For modern artists who encountered these pages, it was a revelation. They saw that a palette could be more than a tool for copying the world. It could be an entire orchestra for composing moods and atmospheres. A painter could now choose to drown a canvas in sorrowful blues or set it ablaze with joyous yellows, using color not to show how a scene looked, but to convey exactly how it felt. This reimagining of color's purpose was one of the manuscript's most profound gifts. It taught a generation that the truest reality an artist can capture is not the one seen with the eyes, but the one felt in the bones. The manuscript tore up the rulebook for how to build a picture. While the artists of the Renaissance were perfecting the science of linear perspective, creating mathematically precise windows into an idealized world, this book's pages offered a different kind of truth. Its compositions were not governed by a single, logical vanishing point that organized everything into a neat, believable space. Instead, the artist arranged elements based on their emotional weight. A central figure might loom unnaturally large, dwarfing everything around it to convey its immense spiritual importance. The horizon line could be tilted at a dizzying angle, not to show a hillside, but to make the viewer feel the ground shifting under their feet during a moment of divine revelation. Figures overlapped in impossible ways, their bodies intersecting not in real space, but in the crowded, chaotic space of a vision or a memory. This was not a failed attempt at perspective. It was a deliberate and brilliant subversion of it. The artist was guiding the viewer's eye not along lines of sight, but along lines of feeling. Your gaze does not travel logically from foreground to background. It jumps from one point of high drama to the next, caught in the whirlwind of the story. For modern artists chafing against the strict geometry of academic painting, this approach was nothing short of liberation. It proved that the canvas was not a window to be looked through, but a mind to be entered. How do you paint a dream? You do not use a ruler, you tilt the world. How do you depict a haunting memory? You let the past and present occupy the same space, overlapping and blurring. This radical approach to composition gave artists the formal tools to explore the inner workings of human consciousness itself, with all its fragments, its distortions, and its deeply personal sense of time and space. The organization of the page became a direct expression of the soul's own architecture. That singular, unmistakable voice echoing from the pages was a quiet rebellion in itself. Most art of its time was a collective endeavor, the product of a workshop where individual hands blended into a single, harmonious style dictated by a patron or a guild. But this manuscript was different. Across every page, you can feel the persistent presence of one unique mind. The same energetic line, the same daring color choices, the same way of twisting a figure to convey anguish, all point to a single creator. This was not an artisan following a set of instructions. This was a person thinking out loud with a brush. That lone, defiant voice, preserved for centuries, became a powerful piece of evidence in a much larger cultural argument. It offered historical proof that the artist could be more than a master craftsman. They could be a visionary. Here was a medieval precedent for the radical idea that an individual's inner world, their personal way of seeing and feeling, was a subject worthy of art. This validation arrived at the perfect moment. In the 19th century, the Romantic movement was championing the artist as a tortured genius, a solitary figure who channeled profound emotions from the depths of their soul. When these Romantic artists and writers looked at the manuscript, they did not see an anonymous monk, they saw a kindred spirit. They saw a man who, like them, had chosen to paint his passions, his doubts, and his ecstasies, rather than a standardized, impersonal ideal. The manuscript's very existence gave their own struggle a deep and respectable history. It was as if this forgotten book whispered across the ages that they, too, had the right to speak in their own unique voice. How powerful is it to discover that your most radical idea is not new at all, but merely rediscovered? This forgotten individual's stubborn insistence on painting his truth helped forge the very concept of artistic individuality that we take for granted today. The right to be yourself, it turns out, can be bound in parchment and waiting in the dark for its moment to return. Word of the strange little book began to leak across borders, carried not by royal decree but by the quiet enthusiasm of artists and scholars. Black and white photographic reproductions, grainy and stark, were tucked into letters and art journals traveling from Paris to Berlin, from London to New York. In smoky cafes and cramped studios, these images passed from hand to hand, becoming a secret currency among the avant-garde. Each new culture that encountered the manuscript saw a different facet of its genius, interpreting its radical language through the lens of their own national anxieties and artistic desires. In France, the symbolists, already obsessed with dreams and the occult, pored over its pages. They were not interested in its biblical stories, but in its method. They saw a precedent for their own work, where a painted image could be a gateway to a higher, mystical truth. A French painter might adopt the manuscript's use of a winding river, but for him, it became a symbol of the subconscious mind, a deep and mysterious current flowing beneath the surface of waking life. Meanwhile, in Germany, a young generation of expressionists discovered the same reproductions and had an entirely different reaction. They were electrified by the raw, unfiltered emotion, by the way the figures seemed to scream from the page without making a sound. For them, the manuscript was a validation of feeling over form. A German artist painting the alienation of modern city life would not copy its specific symbols. Instead, he would embrace its philosophy, distorting the faces of his subjects into masks of anguish, using jarring, unnatural colors to convey the psychological pressure of the metropolis, directly channeling the manuscript's emotional core. This was not a case of simple imitation. It was a process of creative translation. The manuscript provided a spark, and each artist used it to light their own very distinct fire. A single page featuring a figure twisted in prayer could inspire a canvas about spiritual ecstasy in one country and a woodcut about political protest in another. Its power was not in dictating a style, but in granting universal permission to break from realism in the pursuit of a deeper, more personal truth. This shared, yet diversely interpreted, vocabulary created an invisible network. An artist in Russia and an artist in America, who had never met and did not share a language, could look at the same reproduced page and feel they were part of the same unfolding revolution. The manuscript became a catalyst, synchronizing a global shift in artistic sensibilities. It proved that a revolutionary idea, once awakened, does not recognize maps or flags. It flows where it is needed, giving form to the unspoken feelings of an entire age, one daring artist at a time. Of course, the old guard fought back. The artistic establishment, steeped in the traditions of the Renaissance and the Academy, watched this new wave of emotional, distorted art with a growing sense of horror. To them, it was not a revolution, it was pure vandalism. Respected academicians and powerful critics took to the pages of major newspapers, their reviews dripping with contempt. They labeled the work inspired by the manuscript as degenerate, a chaotic mess that betrayed centuries of hard-won technical knowledge. How could these modern painters, they argued, abandon the sacred principles of anatomy, perspective, and harmonious composition? They saw the embrace of this so-called primitive style as a deliberate step backward, a descent into barbarism that threatened the very foundations of Western culture. This was not a minor disagreement over technique. It exploded into a fierce public battle fought in the salons of the elite and the cheap printing presses of the popular press. The debate centered on the most fundamental questions imaginable. What was the true purpose of art? Was beauty an objective, universal standard, something that could be measured by mathematical proportions and perfected over generations? Or was it a deeply personal experience, found in the raw and unfiltered expression of an individual soul? Should a painting exist to educate the viewer, to present an idealized vision of moral and physical perfection? Or was its highest calling to express the artist's inner turmoil and to provoke a powerful, even uncomfortable, feeling in the person who saw it? This conflict was a battle for the soul of creativity itself, One side saw the canvas as a place for order and instruction, a window to a better world. The other, armed with the philosophy of the forgotten manuscript, saw it as a space for confession and emotional truth, a mirror to the human condition. The irony was that the louder and more vicious the criticism became, the more it served the rebels' cause. Every scathing review in a respectable journal was a free advertisement for their radical ideas. The controversy did not silence the new artists, it gave them a platform. It transformed their quiet experimentation into a public spectacle, drawing curious crowds to exhibitions just to see what all the anger was about. The Backlash, intended to crush the movement, instead forged its followers into a tighter, more defiant community. They now had a common enemy, and their resolve hardened. They were no longer just a group of like-minded painters. They were soldiers in a war over what art could be. And sometimes the best way to make an idea powerful is to have someone in authority try and fail to condemn it. The ultimate tribute an artist can pay is not to copy but to converse. A new generation of painters, steeped in the manuscript's rediscovered language, began to create works that spoke directly back to it. These were not forgeries or slavish imitations. They were profound artistic dialogues spanning hundreds of years. One painter, captivated by a page depicting a figure receiving divine grace, transported the entire composition into the heart of a modern industrial city. The celestial light that once fell from heaven now streamed through the grimy windows of a factory, illuminating the face of a weary laborer. The core emotion of redemption remained, but its context was utterly transformed, arguing that grace could be found anywhere, even on an assembly line. Another artist became obsessed with a single, recurring motif from the margins, a small, gnarled tree that symbolized resilience. She isolated this one symbol and built an immense, haunting canvas around it, turning the tiny medieval sketch into a monumental testament of survival against a bleak, abstract landscape. These works served a dual purpose. They were acts of deep respect, a way of acknowledging a forgotten master as a peer, but they were also powerful demonstrations of the manuscript's living relevance. By recontextualizing its scenes, these modern artists proved that its core themes of struggle, faith, and human emotion were not locked in the past, but were universal and urgently present. This practice of artistic dialogue across the centuries reveals a beautiful truth about inspiration. It is not a linear path but a timeless, cyclical exchange. A voice from the Dark Ages could whisper a question, and an artist 500 years later could answer with paint, completing a conversation that had been waiting for its moment. That forgotten book eventually found its way into the classroom. For generations, the curriculum in art academies had been rigid, a strict ladder of skills where students spent years meticulously copying classical sculptures and old master paintings. The ultimate goal was technical perfection, the flawless replication of form and light. Then, a few progressive instructors began to project grainy slides of the manuscript's pages onto the studio wall. They presented these images not as historical curiosities or examples of what not to do, but as powerful case studies in creative bravery. The initial reaction from students was often a ripple of confusion, even discomfort. They were being asked to admire work that broke every rule they were struggling so hard to learn, but the teachers pushed them to look deeper. They designed entirely new exercises around its principles. A life drawing class was no longer just about capturing the precise contour of a shoulder. It was about using an exaggerated line to convey the weight of that shoulder, the fatigue or the strength within it. A color theory assignment shifted from mixing perfect flesh tones to choosing a palette that could paint a mood like anxiety or serenity, using hues that felt true to the emotion rather than the object. This was a pedagogical earthquake. The focus was moving from the hand to the heart, from technical replication to the cultivation of a personal, authentic vision. The manuscript gave teachers the perfect tool to demonstrate that draftsmanship alone was not the end of art. It was merely one of its many possible beginnings. Students were now being graded not only on the accuracy of their perspective but on the courage of their expression. They were taught to ask a new and dangerous question: does this drawing feel true? This shift in the classroom ensured the manuscript's legacy would not fade with a single generation of avant-garde painters. Its philosophy was now being woven into the very fabric of artistic training. A new wave of artists was leaving these reformed academies, their portfolios filled not just with skilled studies, but with works that bore the distinct imprint of a unique inner world. They entered the art scene valuing innovation and emotional honesty as highly as they valued a perfectly rendered hand. The revolution was no longer just happening in rebellious studios. It was being systematically planted in the minds of the young, ensuring its radical roots would grow deep and endure. The manuscript's influence did not ripple out in a single direction, but instead branched into the very bloodstream of modern art. Its symbolic DNA can be clearly identified in the haunting dreamscapes of the symbolists. These artists, searching for truths beyond the visible world, found a kindred spirit in a medieval book that used a winding river to represent the soul's journey and a crimson sky to signify divine wrath. They adopted this language, painting veiled figures and mysterious objects not as literal scenes, but as gateways to a higher, mystical reality. The manuscript gave them a historical precedent for turning the canvas into a portal for the unseen. At the same time, its raw emotional power electrified the Expressionists. They cared little for its specific symbols, but everything for its method. In the manuscript's twisted, anguished figures, they saw a validation of their own mission to distort form in the service of pure feeling. A German painter depicting the isolation of modern life would contort a face into a mask of existential scream, directly channeling the same visceral energy that a medieval monk had used to portray spiritual despair. The same page could inspire two entirely different movements because its genius was not a single style, but a versatile philosophy of expression. Even the bold leap into early abstraction finds a root in this forgotten text. When artists began to suggest that a shape or a color could hold meaning all on its own, they were walking a path this manuscript had hinted at centuries before. Its use of a searing lapis lazuli blue to embody melancholy or a vibrant red to symbolize passion demonstrated that pure color, divorced from any realistic object, could communicate directly with the human spirit. It proposed that art's power might lie not in its ability to depict a tree, but in its capacity to make you feel the shadow of that tree falling across your heart. This forgotten book was not the sole cause of these revolutions, but it served as a crucial catalyst. It provided a historical justification for breaking the rules, offering a visual toolkit ripped from the past that felt utterly new. Artists no longer had to defend their radical work as a complete rejection of tradition. They could point to this ancient volume and say, "We are not destroying art, we are returning to one of its oldest and most profound purposes." The manuscript became a missing link, connecting the spiritual aspirations of the medieval world with the psychological explorations of the modern era. Seeing this lineage changes everything. It allows us to view the entire trajectory of modern art not as a sudden, inexplicable rupture, but as part of a long, evolving conversation. The frantic brushstrokes, the unnatural colors, the fractured forms, they were not merely a rebellion against the Renaissance. They were a reconnection with an even older, more intuitive way of making meaning. The most radical art of the 20th century was, in a profound sense, a distant echo of a lone voice from a silent scriptorium. How many other revolutions are simply rediscoveries, waiting for the right moment to speak again? The artist behind these pages remains a ghost, a name erased by time. We do not know if they were a monk working late into the night, a lay artist hired for a special commission, or even a visionary patron who dared to pick up the brush themselves. This very anonymity has become a blank canvas. Later generations, from Romantic poets to modern painters, have projected their own ideals onto this absent creator, often imagining a tormented genius, isolated and misunderstood, pouring a private anguish onto the sacred page. In a way, this act of reimagining is its own profound form of artistic engagement. We fill the silence with a story that makes sense to us, turning the anonymous scribe into a powerful symbol for every innovator who ever worked ahead of their time, every voice that was not heard in its own age. This process reveals something crucial about how we understand creative revolutions. We crave a face, a biography, a single point of origin for a seismic shift. But history is rarely so neat. The most transformative ideas often emerge from the margins, from individuals whose daily lives and personal struggles are completely lost to us. Their legacy is not a name in a ledger, but the work itself, the undeniable evidence of a mind that saw the world differently. The power of their art ultimately transcends the small, forgotten details of a single life. It belongs not to one person, but to everyone who has ever felt that same restless urge to break a mold or speak in a new tongue. What does it mean that a revolution can be sparked by someone whose own story we will never know? It suggests that the most potent creative force is not fame, but the courage to leave a mark, however quietly, and trust that the work will find its moment to speak. A newfound reverence for the manuscript demanded more than just intellectual admiration. It required a physical rescue. The very pages that had unleashed a creative revolution were themselves perilously fragile. Centuries of light, fluctuating humidity, and the simple, slow chemistry of aging had taken their toll. Some of the vibrant pigments, especially the brilliant blues, were fugitive, meaning they would literally fade away if exposed to too much light. Delicate pages, once repaired with crude stitches by a long-dead monk, threatened to tear completely. The object that had given artists permission to break the rules now needed a team of experts to enforce a strict new set of them. A quiet, meticulous campaign began, not in a studio but in a conservation laboratory. Here, the manuscript was treated not as an idea but as a patient. Conservators worked with surgical precision under magnifying lenses, using tiny brushes and specially formulated adhesives to re-adhere flaking paint and mend torn parchment. They analyzed the chemical composition of the ancient inks to understand how to halt their decay. The most profound act of preservation, however, was an act of restraint. The book was placed in a custom-made case, a cocoon of controlled darkness where temperature and humidity were constantly monitored. Its public display was severely limited, a recognition that its greatest enemy was no longer neglect, but the very admiration it now inspired. How do you protect a source of light without extinguishing its flame? The answer was to build a perfect shadow, a sanctuary where time itself was persuaded to stand still. This physical safeguarding was accompanied by a digital rebirth. High-resolution cameras, equipped with sensitive filters that captured wavelengths beyond human sight, documented every brushstroke and every faint trace of a guideline left by the original artist. These efforts produced a perfect digital facsimile, a ghost of the original that could be sent around the world in an instant. Now, a student in Tokyo or a painter in Buenos Aires could zoom in to study the texture of a single brushstroke, exploring the pages with an intimacy that would be impossible even for someone holding the original in a sterile lab. This was not a replacement for the physical artifact, but a liberation of its spirit. The fight to save the manuscript created a parallel narrative of modern dedication, mirroring the solitary devotion of its creator. It stands as a powerful testament to our collective understanding that protecting the artifacts of our past is not an act of nostalgia, but a direct investment in the creativity of the future. We preserve these objects because we never know which forgotten page, which faded image, might hold the key to the next great awakening. What other fragile keys are we safeguarding today, waiting for the right mind to discover their lock? The manuscript now lives in the cloud. Its once guarded pages are a click away, digitized in such high resolution that an art student in Seoul can study a single brushstroke while a digital painter in Brazil live streams their process of reimagining its symbols. This is not a quiet academic afterlife, it is a vibrant global conversation. Enthusiasts gather in online forums not to deliver lectures but to share theories, posting close-ups of a peculiar beast in the margin and debating its possible meaning for hours. A YouTube video analyzing its color theory can garner millions of views, its comment section becoming a modern-day coffeehouse debate. This digital democratization has shattered the final barrier, transforming the manuscript from an artifact studied by elites into a shared resource owned by collective curiosity. Its influence has been liberated from the physical world. Digital artists armed with styluses and tablets do not merely copy its forms, they translate its philosophy into a new lexicon of light. They create animated sequences where its twisting figures seem to breathe, or design virtual reality experiences where you can step inside its crimson skies and walk alongside its elongated saints. The manuscript's core ideas about symbolic color and emotional distortion are proving to be perfectly suited for the immersive, non-physical spaces of augmented and virtual art. A new generation is using its visual language to build worlds that feel, rather than merely look, real. This journey from a dusty monastic chest to the endless cloud is a modern miracle of preservation and access. The digital age has not diluted the manuscript's strange power. It has amplified it, connecting its ancient voice to tools and imaginations its creator could never have conceived. What new artistic language will emerge when a teenager, inspired by a tweet containing a 700-year-old image, decides to create something entirely new? The manuscript's greatest revolution may still be waiting, not in a gallery, but in the shared digital space where we are all now curators of the future. Look at the world through its eyes, and you will see its signature everywhere. That once forgotten manuscript did not just influence a few art movements, it permanently rewired our collective visual brain. Its legacy pulses through contemporary illustration, where artists use symbolic shorthand to convey complex narratives in a single image. A modern picture book about loneliness might depict a character surrounded by a crowd of faceless, elongated figures, a direct descendant of the manuscript's method of using form to express emotional isolation. In the dynamic pages of graphic novels and the keyframes of major animation studios, you can feel the ghost of its expressive line work. Characters are not drawn with photorealistic precision, but with lines that quiver with energy, that stretch and compress to exaggerate a leap of joy or a slump of defeat, capturing the inner life of the character over their external appearance. This is the manuscript's philosophy in action, teaching us that a distorted line can often tell a truer story than a perfect one. The revolution even reached the sleek world of branding and advertising. Designers tasked with making you feel something in a split second now routinely use the manuscript's color theories. A financial app might be branded with deep, stable blues to evoke trust and security, while an energy drink explodes with unnatural electric yellows and reds to signal intensity and excitement. These are not arbitrary choices. They are calculated applications of a principle the manuscript championed, that color is a direct line to the subconscious. It taught the world that visual communication does not have to be literal to be powerful, that it can be deep, layered, and psychologically potent. The most profound achievement of this medieval book is that its most radical ideas have become invisible. They have been so thoroughly absorbed into our visual literacy that we no longer see them as revolutionary. We simply feel them. We intuitively understand that a tilted horizon means unease, that a monochromatic blue palette suggests melancholy, that a fragmented composition implies a fractured state of mind. We read these visual cues without needing a manual because the manuscript and the art it inspired trained us to do so. Its greatest triumph is not hanging in a museum, but etched into the very way we see. A powerful story inevitably gathers its own legends. Over the decades, the narrative of this single manuscript saving art from itself has been polished into a perfect myth. Some accounts began to claim it was the sole, secret inspiration for iconic modern masterpieces, that a specific painting was a direct, deliberate copy of one of its pages. These stories are compelling, but they are not entirely true. The reality is far more interesting. The manuscript was not a magic key that single-handedly unlocked modern art. It was a crucial voice in a much larger and noisier chorus. The shift toward expression and symbolism was already stirring in the air, a growing restlessness with rigid tradition. This book did not cause the earthquake, but it was a vital tremor that confirmed the ground was already shaking. It gave a scattered movement a historical anchor, a tangible object to point to and say, "See, this path has been walked before." Scholars today carefully sift through letters, exhibition records, and studio inventories to trace its actual influence, separating verifiable connections from romantic speculation. They debate how many artists actually saw the original reproductions versus how many were simply inspired by the new ideas the manuscript had helped unleash in their peers. This rigorous, sometimes dry, work of historical detectivism does not diminish the book's magic. On the contrary, it makes its true impact all the more credible. Its power was not that of a solitary magician, but that of a catalyst, accelerating a reaction that was already brewing. By understanding the limits of its influence, we can better appreciate the sheer scale of the revolution it came to represent. The manuscript was not the only source of a new artistic language, but it was one of the most eloquent and unexpected translators. What does it mean when a legend is more powerful than the facts? It means the story has taken on a life of its own, and in doing so has become a different kind of truth. The true power of this story lies not in the past, but in the urgent questions it poses for our own lives. That forgotten manuscript is a mirror reflecting a timeless truth, that the most transformative ideas almost always arrive wrapped in strangeness, easily mistaken for failure. In our current age of relentless information streams and algorithmic trends, this history offers a crucial corrective. It champions the quiet value of looking deeper, of pausing on the thing that does not fit. When you scroll past a piece of art or an idea that seems awkward or unconventional, you might be looking at a future cornerstone. The manuscript's journey from a dusty chest to a global inspiration is a direct challenge to our obsession with immediate relevance and viral popularity. It argues that true originality is not found in following the trend, but in cultivating the unique perspective that currently has no name. This narrative makes a profound case for preserving obscure knowledge, for protecting the weird and the unprofitable. We must ask ourselves, what are we collectively archiving today? Are we saving only what is popular and easily understood, or are we making space for the difficult, the peculiar, the unintelligibly brilliant work that might make sense only to a future generation. Our modern libraries are not just physical buildings, but the vast digital archives and cloud servers that hold our culture. The choices we make about what to save now will determine which sparks future creators get to fan into flames. This story reframes creativity itself, not as a solitary act of genius, but as a conversation across centuries. We are all participants in this dialogue, whether we realize it or not. Every time we share an unknown artist's work, every time we defend a strange new idea, every time we choose to preserve something simply because it feels important, we are acting like that long-ago curator who pulled a peculiar book from a pile. We are casting a vote for a more interesting and unexpected future. The manuscript's ultimate lesson is one of radical hope. It assures us that no truly original vision is ever permanently lost. It simply sleeps, waiting for the cultural conditions to be right, for the world to finally catch up to its frequency. Your own most unconventional thought, the project that feels too personal or too odd, might be that very seed waiting for its moment in the light. What obscure beauty are you overlooking today that tomorrow will call a masterpiece? This journey from a quiet monastery to the heart of modern art is a profound map of how creativity truly works. It was not a straight line, but a long, patient loop, a conversation that waited centuries for its reply. We have followed this manuscript from its birth in candlelit devotion, through its long sleep in a dusty chest, to its dramatic rediscovery that gave a generation of artists the courage to feel first and paint second. Its legacy is not locked in a museum vault, but lives and breathes in every bold color choice, every emotionally charged line, and every symbolic layer we now expect from powerful art. This entire story is an invitation. It asks us to cultivate a certain kind of vision, to look at the world and the art that surrounds us with a more curious and questioning gaze. We are prompted to wonder about the hidden currents that shape our tastes, to question why a certain image feels true, and to recognize that the most familiar visual languages were once radical and strange. Let this be a call to value the forgotten, to champion the unusual, and to listen carefully to the misunderstood. The next great artistic revolution is almost certainly not being celebrated on a mainstream stage right now. It is likely taking shape in a quiet studio, on a forgotten hard drive, or in the margins of a notebook, waiting for its moment to be seen. What piece of art from any era do you believe was so far ahead of its time that the world is only just beginning to catch up? Share your discovery in the comments below.